Hey, welcome to Restoration. I'm Rabbi Matt, and our regular recording of our message didn't work today, so I'm just gonna stand here in my office and re-preach this message because I think it's an important message, and it's the start of a three-part series called Clean, and the idea is over the next 3 weeks, we're gonna talk about what it means, the difference between clean and unclean according to the Torah. And generally we're going to talk about food as it's talked about in the Torah, but then understanding that even the separations from food that God gave to the Jewish people are not just about food, but they are about people and the way that we treat people and treat each other. And separation is a hard thing for people because the separation of God for the Jewish people from the nations has been misunderstood both in Jewish circles and also in non-Jewish circles. And separation is a principle for understanding how we live. In fact, this is where holiness comes from. The word holy in Hebrew is kadosh, and kadosh really means, could be translated as completely other. So when God says, be holy for I am holy, what he's saying is be completely other because I am completely other. And part of being completely other is being different or separate from other things, or in the case of the Jewish people, from other people. And so separation is a principle for understanding how we live and how we act, and clean, understanding what is clean and what is unclean affects our daily decisions. Now, God set apart the Jewish people for himself, but his purpose in separation was for conversation. And the purpose in the conversation was the restoration of all the nations. So God separated the Jewish people, much like there are 12 tribes of the Jewish people, but one of those tribes is the priesthood, and the priesthood was set apart, the tribe of Levi was set apart from the other tribes as the ones who would do the daily work of the temple and do the sacrifice to atone for the people. And in the same way, the Jewish people then, and I believe the Jewish people now, still have a role as a priesthood to the nations. Now, the scripture tells us that anybody who believes in Yeshua, calls on the name of Yeshua, is a part of this priesthood, but there is still distinction and separation for Jew and for Gentile within. And part of that, the last few weeks, we've kind of done individual messages where we talked about Shabbat, the Sabbath, where we talked about circumcision and immersion, or what some know as baptism. And we talked about tzitzis, or the commandments of the fringes that Jewish people wear. And all of these things lend themselves to this idea of separation. So for these 3 weeks, we're doing this series called Clean, and today is Clean and Unclean. Next week is fixing the assumptions that we have about people, and the third week is God calling a people for himself from the Gentiles. And generally we're using Mark chapter 7 today, and Acts 10 next week, and Acts 15 the third week, to kind of run through this idea of what clean and unclean means and how it's supposed to play out in our lives. And Judaism, for those who keep kosher, there's a separation or observance of dietary laws, and they are both an opportunity for obedience to God, but also a part of preserving Jewish unity and identity. Now, these separations for the Jewish people by God are not about superiority, and the assumption with separation is that you would think, in the way the world works, that separate would not give you opportunity to open doors to other people. But separation leads to conversation, and conversation leads to restoration. In fact, it's the design of the Jewish people. It's what we as the Jewish people are actually called to do, or chosen to do, which is to be a light to the nations. Well, how can we be a light to the Gentiles if we have nothing to do with Gentiles because we're so separate that we don't do anything with Gentiles or no Gentiles or talk to Gentiles. And it goes back to a message that I did last week on keeping the commandment keeping for dummies. And the idea that all commandment keeping comes down to these three things: to look and to remember and to observe. So why are the Jewish people supposed to do these things like the Sabbath and the holidays and circumcision? Why, and keeping kosher, why would God give us these things? And it's because it's a part of us belonging to God and God being our God and we being his people. But not to keep him to ourselves, but rather to be a priesthood to the nations and show the Gentiles that there's only one God who sent his son Yeshua to live and to die and to rise on the third day during the holiday, during the feast of Passover, so that we and all people, Jew and Gentile, could have new life in the name of Yeshua. So we try to be as clear as possible here at Restoration, and we get a couple questions when it comes to issues of food. One, should Jewish people keep kosher? And the answer is yes. The dilemma is that kosher means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and there's a lot of assumptions that people bring toward what kosher is in the first place. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Second is, do Gentiles have to keep kosher? And the simple answer is no, they don't. And that's what we're going to talk over the next the next 2 weeks in particular, in Acts chapter 10 in the New Testament and Acts chapter 15 and the original Jewish disciples of Yeshua, and the wrestling through of these things that they had to do for themselves. So, what we come to in Judaism is when somebody says, I keep kosher, what people think about when they say the word kosher, depending on different contexts that people come from. One, it's used in general conversation now for many people, where if you say something that you don't like or something that's not good, you just say that's not kosher in kind of conversational context. But when people hear the idea of kashrut or keeping kosher, they think about washing hands, and they think about the mixing of milk and meat. They think about how to kill a certain animal and what parts of the animal we're supposed to eat. And they think about rabbinic supervision, this whole process of the rabbis as they supervise the parts to make sure of the preparation of food, to make sure that things are kosher. Of course, the dilemma with all of those things is there are pieces of those things that are not from the Torah, but were added to the Torah, and are called commandments, but are not actually commandments that God gave the Jewish people. Now, this isn't an evil thing. As we talk about the Pharisees, and we talk about the kind of development of thought. When the Torah says, "Do not do your regular work on the Sabbath," well, somebody had to come along and say, "Well, what's regular work?" And they had to sit down and try to think of, okay, this is regular work, and this is not regular work, and this is, and this isn't, and kind of think through all the ways that people work and how work applies and whether work should be done. So these kind of fleshing through those things is not wrong, but when those things, the fleshing out of those things then leads to commandments, or people say this is a commandment from God, and it's not, and it's something that some people came up with to help us keep commandments, but then those things actually become more important than the commandments themselves. Like the idea of rabbinic supervision, which reminds me of this joke. A rabbi was walking home from a synagogue, and he saw one of his good friends, Saul, who went into a restaurant that wasn't kosher. And in that restaurant, he noticed he stood by the door, and he saw his friend Saul talking to the waiter and getting a menu and sitting down, and he ordered all these things off the menu, like the spare ribs and the shrimp and the crab and the lobster. And the rabbi's thinking to himself, I can't believe Saul's doing this. And he's watching, and he picks up the food is delivered to the table, and he's eating all the food, and he's enjoying the food, and he pays the bill, and he comes out, and Saul sees the rabbi, and the rabbi says, Saul, what were you doing? I saw you in the restaurant, and Saul says, oh, Rabbi, did you see me enter the restaurant? And the rabbi says, yes. And did you see me order this meal? And the rabbi says, yeah, I did. I watched the whole thing. he said, did you see the way to bring my food to the table? I did, yes. And I didn't know what you were doing. And did you see me eat the food, Rabbi? And he said, yes, I saw it. And Saul said to the rabbi, then, Rabbi, I don't see what the problem is, because the entire meal took place under strict rabbinic supervision. Oh, I love that joke. And sometimes what happens in the keeping of commandments for these things is we become so focused on the extra things or the added things that we actually end up not keeping the commandments themselves. So people will ask, what is the point of keeping kosher for Jewish people? And again, the answer is the observance of dietary laws is both an opportunity for obedience, but it's also a preservation of Jewish identity. And it comes from Leviticus chapter 11. And in Leviticus 11 and verse 43, after a long list of animals that are unclean, animals that Jewish people should not eat, it says, you are not to contaminate yourselves with any creeping things that crawl, nor make yourselves unclean with them or defiled by them. For I am Adonai your God. Therefore sanctify yourselves and be holy, for I am holy. You're not to defile yourselves with any kind of creeping thing that moves on the earth, for I am Adonai who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. Therefore you should be holy, for I am holy. This is the Torah of the animal, the law for the animal, the bird, and every living creature that moves in the water, and every creature that creeps on the earth, to make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, between the living thing that may be eaten and the living thing that may not be eaten. And then the other place there's two lists of what God tells the Jewish people are unclean. Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. And after the list in Deuteronomy 14, it says a similar, for you are, in verse 2 and 3, for you are a holy people to Adonai your God. For all the peoples of the earth, Adonai has chosen you to be his treasured people. You are not to eat any detestable thing. So you see this word holy over and over again. You see the words like distinction. There's a distinction between the clean and unclean, and there's a separation of the Jewish people from the nations. And in that separation, we're not to eat all the same things that the nations around us eat. And we're to, the verse right in Leviticus 11 is be holy for I am holy, or Deuteronomy 14, because you are a holy people. And when God uses the word kadosh in these two places, he's saying, instead of reading it as holiness, you could read it as be completely other, because I am completely other. Now, why does God want us, the Jewish people, to be completely other? Why does he want us to be different from the nations around us? Well, it's not just for our own sake. People can say all the time, the foods, unclean food, the foods that are listed are not good for you. There's like a hygiene reason. There's health reasons. There's discipline reasons. And the rabbis will walk through all of these different reasons of why you should keep kosher. But really, what it comes down to is observing the things that God told us to do, and as a separation from the nations. Because separation leads to conversation. It happened to me so many times where when I was in high school, I wore a kippah, and my tzitzis, the fringes that I wore them out, so I had my tzitzis hanging out and my kippah on my head, and I would go into McDonald's and I would order food, and inevitably a Jewish person would come to me in McDonald's and they would say, "Why are you eating here?" And I would say, "Why are you eating here?" And they would say, "Well, I'm not religious, but you clearly are because of the way that you're dressed and because of the things that you're wearing. So I don't understand why you would eat at a non-kosher restaurant." And I said, "Well, I'm not eating any non-kosher food." And they would be very perplexed, and we would have a kind of a back and forth of who's right and who's wrong. You can't mix milk and meat. And I would say, well, if you can't mix milk and meat, but there's no commandment in the Torah that actually says that. It's an added rule for all kinds of reasons, but I just choose not to do that. But I don't eat pork, and I don't eat shellfish, and I don't eat the things that are listed in the list. Of course, the conversation would at some point be ruined because I would say I believe in Jesus, and then they'd say you're not really Jewish, and then I'd say, well, enjoy your Big Mac, and I'll enjoy mine. And one of those things that happens is with separation comes conversation. When you do something different, it lends itself to conversation. So every time we go to a restaurant, and every time we go to eat, and every time we're with people I know or with people I don't know, I have to look through a menu, and I have to ask for the ingredients, and I have to talk to the waiter, and they say, "Why do you care?" And I say, "Because I'm Jewish, and God commanded us not," and it opens doors for conversation. Why do you care so much to do those things? One very influential pastor asked me not too long ago, "Why does Jewish identity matter to you?" And it matters because it matters to me, because it matters to Jesus, who is Jewish, who would have never eaten these things, and who never told his followers, his Jewish followers, to stop keeping the commandments that God gave to our people. That these are covenants that God made with our fathers that we're supposed to keep. Oh, Gentiles who follow Jesus don't have to keep all of the same things that we keep. And in our community at Restoration, we have a wide variety of people in our community who keep kosher and don't keep kosher. We have some like our assistant rabbi, Ibars, who's Turkish, and his family, when he chooses to keep kosher in similar way that I keep kosher because of the commitment that he made to the Lord. There's other people who are Gentiles in our community don't keep kosher at all. And there's a wide variety of people who do and people who don't. And Gentiles can keep kosher if they'd like to. According to the Torah, it just doesn't make a Gentile Jewish as much as a Jewish person can't really become a Gentile. So this distinction in all of these different ways and this separation is designed for conversation, and the conversation hopefully leads to a restoration for people who are far from God to come back to God. Now, our rabbi at Restoration, our chief rabbi is Yeshua, the Messiah. And so when there's a disagreement between the rabbis of the rest of Judaism and Yeshua, particularly in the Gospels, then it's our responsibility to side with Yeshua. And there's several places in the Gospels where there are things that are not commanded that the rabbis call commandments and tell people they must do, where Yeshua argues or didn't do or argues that you shouldn't do. Now, there's other traditions that he keeps, so don't hear this message as being against tradition, whether it's Jewish Christian or Christian tradition or any tradition. But when traditions become more important than the commandment themselves, then we find ourselves in a very precarious place where we are dictating what we ought to do rather than wrestling with whether we should do the things that we are doing. One of those places, one of my favorite stories in the Gospels, and one of those places is Mark chapter 7. And in Mark chapter 7, it's so clear that there's a tradition called Natilat Yadayim. And Natilat Yadayim is the washing of hands. And the blessing that Jewish people do who observe this when they say the blessing is they will use a pitcher with two handles, and you pour, and as you pour and you wash your hands, you say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctified us through your commandments and commanded us concerning the washing of hands." But of course, for us as a Messianic community, there's no commandment for washing your hands before you eat. And even in the first century, which is later recorded in the Talmud, there's a very practical idea that when you are about to have a meal that includes bread, you must wash your hands. This is what the rabbis say. You must wash your hands and say the blessing of Natilat Yadayim. And in saying the blessing, if you don't say the blessing before you eat bread, then the kosher food that you're eating is no longer kosher. And so in the Gospels, in Mark chapter 7 and verse 1, it says, "Now the Pharisees and some of the Torah scholars who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Yeshua, and they saw that some of his disciples were eating bread with unclean hands, that is, not washed." So if you're watching, you have your Bible out, or you use a digital version of the Bible, you just highlight, "We're eating bread with unclean hands that were not washed." Because that's ultimately the issue that the Pharisees had, is that Yeshua and his disciples were apparently not following the tradition of eating bread and washing their hands before they eat the bread. And then Mark continues and says, for the Pharisees and all the Jewish people do not eat unless they wash their hands up to the elbow, keeping the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they perform a ritual washing. And there are many other traditions that they have received and hold, such as washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels. And the Pharisees and the Torah scholars question Yeshua, why don't your disciples walk according to the tradition of the elders? Why do they eat bread with unwashed hands? And it's so wonderfully specific. And if you miss Jewish context, you don't have an understanding of Judaism in the first century and know that this was a very specific and very particular issue, then you would read the rest of Mark 7 as, in some translations, at the end of this story, it says, in this he made all foods clean, which is not necessarily what Yeshua is saying. In the rest of the end of the story, verse 17, it says, when the crowd left and entered the house, his disciples asked him about the parable. And he said to them, and of course this happens with Yeshua's disciples all the time, he says something that doesn't make sense, but actually does make sense, but doesn't make sense according to the way they've understood things. And they're just as confused as the others who are listening. And they say, so we're confused too. And he says, are you also lacking understanding? Don't you grasp that whatever goes into a man cannot make him unholy? For it does not enter the heart, but in the stomach, and then goes out into the sewer, cleansing all the foods. And this is where in some translations it says he made all foods clean, which leads some theologians to say that Jesus did this in order to break kosher law, but the kosher law that he's breaking is one that was added by the Pharisees and the rabbis. It was not a commandment actually in the Torah. And there is nowhere in the Torah where Yeshua sits down and eats a ham sandwich and tells his disciples to do the same. Because they're all Jewish and they don't eat unclean food. And even though Yeshua is saying, don't you understand that what goes into the body isn't what makes you unclean? But except it is, isn't it? Because we just read in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy that these unclean foods make you unclean. But one, they only make you unclean till evening. And after the evening is over, you're no longer unclean. And two, it does make you unclean, but Yeshua's point is so much deeper than whether the food makes you clean or unclean, because he continues and he says, look, it's going to come out of your body anyway, and it's going to literally come, well, it'll end up in the sewer, if you understand what I'm saying, and you're certainly not going to eat that after, and it will be unclean then, but it's not necessarily what goes in, he says, it's what comes out of the man that makes the man unholy. For from within, out of the heart of men, come evil intentions, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustfulness, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. And all these evil things come from within and make the man unholy. So, you could do well as a Jewish person to not eat any of the foods that are unclean. But if you are keeping kosher and also committing adultery and also engaging in murder and wickedness and deceit and sexual immorality and lust and envy and slander and pride, then the kosher things that you're eating don't matter. Because it's not just what goes in to your mouth and into your stomach that comes out later. It's what comes out of your heart and out of your mouth that makes us unholy. And we all, Jew and Gentile alike, struggle with the sinfulness of our hearts and our minds. And all you have to do, whether you think you believe in sin or not, is know all the thoughts that come to your mind. And in knowing all of the thoughts that surprise you with, why would I even think that? Are evidence that the things that are coming out of your mouth and from your heart are evil and unholy. And so it's a reminder to us. The whole idea of Jewish people keeping kosher is a reminder that every time we eat food, we are supposed to wrestle with what we don't eat so that we can keep all the other commandments. Last week, we talked about the greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength. And love your neighbor as yourself. And Yeshua said, on these two hang all the law and the prophets. So congratulations if you have never eaten pork before, or you've never eaten crab bisque or clam chowder. Congratulations if you are the most clean eating person in the world. But if you engage in evil intention, in sexual immorality, in theft and murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, right? Most of us are like, I've never committed adultery. I've never committed murder. Well, how about greed, wickedness, deceit, lustfulness, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness? All these things come from within and make the man unholy. So in this way, Yeshua is not saying to his Jewish disciples or to the Pharisees, we no longer keep kosher. He is saying, I don't do all the things that you do. And I didn't tell you to wash your hands. And I didn't tell you. It is, look, as a Messianic community, we have a responsibility that when we say blessings to do things, and the blessing says, and commanded us concerning the washing of hands. But if there is no such commandment in the Torah, then we shouldn't say that prayer. We shouldn't say that blessing. In fact, some of us in our community, in the Messianic Judaism, even with the Shabbat candles, there's the lighting of the candles at the start of Shabbat on Friday night. And again, it's a symbolic representation of the separation between light and darkness, and sacred and secular. It's the same idea of separation. But the traditional blessing is to, blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, who has commanded us to light the Shabbat candles. But there is no commandment to light the Shabbat candles. There is no commandment to light the candles for Hanukkah. And we say the same blessing at Hanukkah, who has commanded us to light the Hanukkah candles. But he didn't command us. People commanded us later. And the traditions are not bad. So simply what we do is in our home, for our family, when we light the Shabbat candles on Friday night, we just say a different blessing because we like the symbolism of separation. But I'm not going to say that he commanded us because he didn't. I am going to light the candles, which we don't do every week. And we say, blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments, given us Yeshua, our Messiah, and commanded us to be a light to the world. Because that he commanded us to do. In Isaiah, about 35 times. In the Gospels, as Yeshua leaves, he tells his disciples to be a light to the world, to go and tell everyone. And that is a commandment that we have as Jewish people, to be a light to the nations. And anyone from any nation who calls on the name of Yeshua has the same responsibility. And so in our community here at Restoration, we want to be a place that exists to lead people to become fully devoted followers of Yeshua. Which means we're going to play with all kinds of things that will make all kinds of people uncomfortable. In fact, recently we took out we're processing the Torah around the room. When we take the Torah scroll out and we process it around the room, and the tradition is to wear a talit, and with the fringes you kiss it, and really it confused everyone who came through the door, Jew and Gentile alike. We had to explain it to everyone, and I don't want anyone to be offended until they get to the sermon. I don't want anybody to miss what we're going to teach out of the Word of God because something else was a stumbling block before. And we can all agree or disagree, and different communities can choose to do different things as communities. But when we choose, we're going to keep changing because the world around us is changing and the culture around us is changing, and we're trying to reach people in this culture. And as one who grew up in Messianic Judaism and what we call this modern synagogue movement of Messianic Judaism, let me just say, and this is not a judgment on other Messianic congregations, but years ago, There were Jewish people, my parents and their generation, the boomers in the 60s and 70s, were coming to faith in Jesus as Jewish people and decided we can remain Jewish and follow Jesus, well, just like him and his disciples. But what does that look like? And what do we do? And we need to start our own synagogues, and we need to develop these different things. And in that, we developed different traditions of our own and had to wrestle through all of these things that we're talking about. And for most Messianic congregations that I am aware of, they exist to reach Jewish people. And at Restoration, we don't exist to reach Jewish people. We exist to reach everyone we can from every nation. Now, we are unapologetically to the Jew first because I love my own people and I want my people to turn back to our Messiah who came for us. But I also don't want to be a stumbling block to the Gentiles. And the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk about Acts 10 and Acts 15, where Yeshua sets the disciples free from these things and encourages them in their own development, even after his death and resurrection in the book of Acts, to go for everybody. And so at Restoration, we want Jews to be Jews and Gentiles to be Gentiles, and we recognize that we can all be part of the same family, even with a variety of traditions and things that we do and that we say. I mean, this morning we sang a song in our service about Calvary, coming to Calvary. And growing up, in the context I grew up in, we would have never sang that song because we don't say Calvary, because Calvary is like a word for the cross, and Christians say it. And, you wrestle through all of these things through generations. But ultimately, our goal is for our families and our friends and the people we work with and the people around us to come to faith in Yeshua. And we believe that the Jewish and historical context of understanding Jesus as a Jewish person and understanding how could you understand Mark chapter 7 if you don't know that it's traditional, part of the tradition of the elders to say a blessing, specific blessing before you eat bread. And if you don't understand the context of it, then you miss the point that Yeshua is trying to make, and you can make it into something entirely different because you miss the context. And we are believing here at Restoration that we're not just going to help Jewish people see Yeshua as the Messiah, but we're going to help Gentiles who want to understand historical context of Yeshua, Jesus as a Jewish person, and his disciple as Jewish people who continued to do these things as Jews, but then wrestled with, do Gentiles have to keep the Sabbath? Do Gentiles have to keep kosher? Do they have to do the holidays? Do they have to circumcise their sons? What does that look like? And in the next 2 weeks, we're going to deal with that specifically in Acts chapter 10 and Acts chapter 15. But it's not just what goes in to the body that makes someone unholy, that makes us unclean. It's what comes out of our mouths. And if the purpose of what we do is to make ourselves better than everybody else and to do it the most right and to do it the best way, and if you don't do it the way that I do it, then you're not doing it right, then we miss the whole wrestle with the commandments and what we're supposed to do. See, the separation of the Jewish people was about knowing the difference between clean and unclean. And separation is a principle that leads to conversation. And conversations lead to restoration for Jews and for Gentiles. And God set apart the Jewish people for himself, but his purpose ultimately then and still now was to open the doors wide for anyone from any nation who calls on the name of Yeshua to turn to the God who formed you in your mother's womb and bring you back to himself. Whether you are a Jewish person or whether you are from one of the nations, a Gentile, it's all the same. God is calling us back to himself because knowing Yeshua changes everything. And if you take the time to know him and to understand him, not just the things you were told about him, but what the Gospels say about him and the things that he taught, And that sometimes when he disagrees with the rabbis, it means we have to disagree with the rabbis. Sometimes there are disagreements with church fathers and we have to disagree with them. And there's all this kind of tension and there's all this voices and all these things around us of this is how you do it right and this is how you do it right and this is what you're supposed to do. But if it doesn't lead you to a better understanding of what comes out of your mouth, evil intentions, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wickedness, deceit, lustfulness, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness, then friends, you're just not doing it right. The goal is to be clean so that we can lead others to who are unclean to find out what it means to be made clean in the name of Yeshua. Let me pray for you. Lord, we just thank you for who you are and who you've called us to be. Lord, I pray if anyone is watching and has not received Yeshua as the Messiah, that this would be the day of their salvation, that they would call on the name of Yeshua. And Lord, for those of us who follow Yeshua, would you help us not to be only concerned with the outside and what goes in, but would you help us to be concerned with what comes out of our mouths? Lord, would you make us people who love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, and all our strength, and love our neighbors as ourselves, so that we can show people what it means to be made clean. In Yeshua's name, amen.